Brio English podcast.
Laugh, learn, love English. Think about a relationship that matters to you. A close friendship, a marriage, a working relationship with a colleague you respect, a relationship with a family member you love. Now think about the last time you disagreed with that person. Really disagreed. Not about something small, about something that genuinely mattered to both of you. And ask yourself honestly, how did that go?
Honestly, some of the most important disagreements in my life have gone terribly. Not because the disagreement itself was impossible, but because of how it was handled. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. Feelings were hurt that took a long time to heal. And sometimes the relationship never fully recovered. Not from the disagreement itself, but from the way it was conducted.
And that's the thing most people don't realize. It's almost never the disagreement that damages a relationship. Disagreement is natural and healthy and inevitable between people who think for themselves. What damages relationships, sometimes permanently, is how the disagreement happens. The specific words used, the tone, the moment chosen, whether the other person feels heard or simply overridden, whether the disagreement feels like a conversation or an attack.
So two people can disagree about exactly the same thing, and one pair comes out of it with their relationship stronger, and another pair comes out of it barely speaking. The disagreement is identical. The outcome is completely different, because the process was different.
Exactly. And the process, how you disagree, is entirely within your control. It's a set of skills, specific, learnable, practicable skills that allow you to hold your position, express your genuine view, challenge someone's thinking, and do all of that without making the other person feel attacked, dismissed, or disrespected. Today we're going through every one of those skills. I'm Alex, this is Maya, this is Brio English Podcast. Let's go.
Before we get into the skills, I want to understand the psychology, because most people I know, including me, have a complicated relationship with disagreement. Some people avoid it completely. Others go into it like a battle they need to win. Why does disagreement feel so threatening?
Because on a very deep psychological level, disagreement feels like rejection. When someone disagrees with your idea or your opinion, your brain can experience it as a rejection of you as a person, not just your view, you. And rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. That's not a metaphor, it's neuroscience. Being disagreed with actually hurts in a measurable physiological way.
So when someone disagrees with us, we don't just think they're wrong. We feel physically threatened on some level, which explains why people either shut down completely or become aggressive when disagreed with. Fight or flight, but verbal.
Exactly. And once the threat response is activated, rational conversation becomes almost impossible. The part of the brain responsible for logic and empathy, the prefrontal cortex, gets overridden by the emotional response. The person is no longer thinking clearly. They're defending themselves. And nothing you say at that point, however logical, however reasonable, will land effectively.
So the entire skill of disagreeing well is essentially about keeping the other person's threat response from activating, disagreeing in a way that doesn't trigger their defensive brain.
That's precisely it. And the language you use, the specific words and phrases, either activate that threat response or they don't. There are phrases that almost instantly put someone on the defensive, and there are phrases that allow genuine disagreement to happen without triggering the fight or flight response. The difference between the two, in many cases, is just a few specific words.
Which means this is entirely learnable. You can't control how you feel when someone disagrees with you, but you can control the words you choose when you disagree with them, and those words determine whether the conversation stays productive or becomes a battle.
Exactly right. Let's get into the specific skills. Skill 1, and this is the single most important skill in all of disagreement. Acknowledge what the other person has said before you challenge it. Not fake acknowledgement, genuine acknowledgement. Finding the part of their position that makes sense, that has merit, before you explain why you see it differently.
Before we go further, if you find these conversations valuable, Subscribing means you never miss one. New episodes every Monday and Thursday. Now, genuine acknowledgement. Why is this so powerful?
Because it does something crucial. It separates the person from their position. When you acknowledge what's valid in someone's view before challenging it, you're signaling that you've actually heard them, that you've considered their perspective seriously, that you're not dismissing them. And that signal, "I have genuinely heard you," is what keeps the threat response from activating. The person feels seen even as their view is being challenged.
What does this actually sound like in practice? Give me the contrast.
Without acknowledgement, I disagree with that approach. I think you're overlooking the budget implications and the timeline is completely unrealistic. That's a direct challenge with no acknowledgement. The person who just shared that approach hears, "My idea is wrong, and I didn't think it through." Defensive response activated immediately.
With acknowledgement, I can see why this approach is attractive. The creative direction is genuinely strong, and I understand the thinking behind the timeline. Where I see it differently is on the budget implications. I think they're more significant than the current model shows. Can we look at those numbers together?
Same disagreement, same fundamental challenge. But the other person hears, "My idea has genuine merit. This person has understood what I was trying to do, and they have a specific concern about one aspect of it." That's a very different emotional experience, and it keeps the conversation productive rather than defensive.
The specific phrases that do this acknowledgement work. What are the most effective ones in English?
I can see why you'd think that, and where I see it differently is, this is one of the most powerful disagreement phrases in English. It acknowledges the logic of their position while clearly signaling that a different view is coming. The "and" rather than "but" is critical, as we discussed in episode 8, but erases what came before and builds on it.
That's a fair point. I'd add to it, though. This acknowledges their contribution as valid while building rather than opposing. You're not saying they're wrong, you're extending the conversation.
I think we're actually closer than it seems. The difference is really about, this is particularly powerful because it reframes the disagreement as a small gap rather than a fundamental opposition. It keeps both people feeling like they're on the same side trying to solve a problem, rather than on opposite sides fighting each other.
That reframe is so important. Disagreements feel so much more manageable when they're framed as a small difference in perspective rather than a fundamental conflict of values or intelligence.
Skill 2, the most violated rule in all of disagreement. Attack the idea, never the person. This sounds obvious. Almost everyone agrees with it in theory. Almost everyone violates it in practice, usually without realizing they're doing it.
How does attacking the person happen without people realising? Because surely most people know not to call someone stupid in a disagreement.
Direct insults are rare. The subtle person attacks are everywhere. They happen through language that implies something about the person's intelligence, their values, their motivations, or their character, rather than staying focused on the specific idea being discussed. You always do this. You never think these things through. That's typical of your approach. I'm surprised you think that. All of these have moved from the idea to the person, and once you've attacked the person, even subtly, the disagreement has become personal, and personal disagreements are almost impossible to resolve productively.
What about "you always" and "you never" specifically? Because I think these are incredibly common and incredibly damaging.
You always and you never are two of the most destructive phrases in any disagreement, because they're generalizations that are almost never literally true, and the person being accused knows it. The moment you say, "You always interrupt me," the other person's brain immediately finds the exceptions, the times they didn't interrupt, and suddenly they're defending themselves against the generalization rather than engaging with the specific behavior that actually bothered you. The conversation has moved entirely off the real issue.
So the specific version is always stronger. Not "you always interrupt me," but "in our last 2 meetings you interrupted me before I finished my point, and I want to raise that because it matters to me."
Specific, recent, factual, behavior not character. That version can be acknowledged and addressed. The generalization can only be defended against. And there's another subtle person attack that's very common: questioning motives. You only think that because it benefits you. You're just saying that to win the argument. You don't actually believe that. All of these attack the person's honesty and integrity rather than their idea. And once you've questioned someone's integrity, the disagreement has become a completely different and much more dangerous kind of conversation.
Questioning someone's motives is so destabilizing because you're not just saying they're wrong, you're saying they're dishonest, and nobody can productively engage with a disagreement when they're simultaneously defending their character.
Stay on the idea, always. I think this approach has a significant flaw in the financial projections, is about the idea. You're only pushing this because it's your project, is about the person. One can be discussed. The other can only be fought. Skill 3, and this one fundamentally changes the nature of disagreement. Lead with curiosity rather than certainty. Most people approach disagreement as a position to be defended. I know I'm right, and I need to convince them. But the most effective disagreeers approach it as a genuine exploration. I have a different view, and I'm interested in understanding theirs more deeply before we work out where the truth lies.
That sounds almost counterintuitive. If you genuinely believe you're right, why would you approach it with curiosity rather than conviction?
2 reasons. First, you might be wrong. Or at least, you might be missing information that would change your view. The person you're disagreeing with may have context, experience, or data that you don't have. Approaching with genuine curiosity rather than closed certainty keeps you open to updating your position based on new information, which makes you a more effective thinker, not a weaker one.
And the second reason?
People are far more open to changing their view when they feel genuinely heard and respected. If you come into a disagreement with the energy of "I'm right and I'm going to prove it," the other person's defenses go up immediately. But if you come in with the energy of "I see this differently and I'm genuinely interested in understanding your thinking," they feel respected. And respected people are dramatically more open to reconsidering their position than defensive people.
So paradoxically, approaching with curiosity rather than certainty actually makes it more likely that the other person will come around to your view because they don't feel they have to defend themselves.
Exactly. The specific phrases of curious disagreement. Help me understand your thinking on this. What led you to that conclusion? I'm seeing this quite differently. Can you walk me through how you got there? All of these signal genuine interest in the other person's reasoning before presenting your own. And what happens when you ask these questions is fascinating. Very often the other person, in the process of explaining their thinking, identifies the weaknesses in it themselves. You didn't have to point them out. Curiosity created the space for self-reflection.
So asking genuine questions about their reasoning can lead them to identify the problems themselves, which is infinitely more effective than pointing out the problems for them, because it doesn't trigger defensiveness.
And even when they don't identify the weaknesses themselves, asking those questions gives you much better information about what you're actually dealing with. You understand their position more deeply, which means your challenge, when it comes, is much more precisely targeted and much harder to dismiss. Skill 4. The specific English phrases that allow you to disagree clearly and directly while keeping the conversation respectful and the relationship intact. Because there's a real skill in this, between being so indirect that your disagreement gets lost and being so direct that it feels like an attack.
The balance between being clear enough that your disagreement is understood and being respectful enough that the relationship survives it.
First phrase, I see this quite differently. 3 simple words but very powerful. It states clearly that you disagree without characterizing their view as wrong. You're not saying they're wrong, you're saying you see it differently. That's a much less threatening statement that opens conversation rather than closing it.
Second, I'd push back on that slightly. This is a very useful professional phrase in English. Push back is a business term for respectful challenge, slightly softens it without undermining the substance of your challenge. I'd push back on the timeline assumption here. I think 6 weeks is optimistic, given what we know about the approval process.
Third, I'm not sure I agree. Can I share why? This phrase does something subtle and powerful. By asking permission to share your disagreement, you're giving the other person a moment to mentally prepare to receive a challenge. They feel respected enough to be asked. And that small act of asking creates psychological safety for the disagreement that follows.
Fourth, what I'd add to that is, rather than what you're missing is, both phrases introduce additional information or perspective, but what you're missing implies they've failed to see something obvious, which is insulting. What I'd add frames it as a contribution rather than a correction. Same information, completely different emotional impact.
And fifth, I wonder if we're defining this differently. This phrase is extraordinarily useful when a disagreement seems irresolvable. Very often, seemingly fundamental disagreements are actually disagreements about definitions. Two people using the same word to mean different things. I wonder if we're defining success differently here. When you say the project succeeded, what does that mean for you? That question has resolved more apparently intractable disagreements than almost any other. Skill 5, and this one requires the most wisdom of all 5. Knowing when to stop trying to resolve a disagreement and simply acknowledge that two people see something differently, and that's okay. Not every disagreement needs to be resolved. Not every difference of opinion needs a winner.
I think a lot of people struggle with this because they feel that agreeing to disagree means giving up, or that the other person has won, or that the relationship is in some way broken because you couldn't reach agreement.
And that's exactly backwards. Agreeing to disagree, when done well, is actually a sign of a mature and strong relationship. It says, I respect you enough to allow you to hold a different view from mine. I don't need you to agree with me to value our relationship. Our connection doesn't depend on seeing everything the same way. That's a profound form of respect that many relationships never achieve.
And in English, there are specific phrases for closing a disagreement, gracefully without a resolution. I think we see this differently, and I respect that. We might have to agree to disagree on this one. I understand your position even if I don't share it. All of these close the disagreement, while preserving the relationship completely.
The key distinction, agreeing to disagree on opinions and perspectives is healthy. Agreeing to disagree on facts or on matters that require action is different. Those need resolution. But on questions of value, belief, preference, and interpretation, the ability to hold different views without it damaging the relationship is one of the hallmarks of a genuinely strong connection.
The healthiest relationships I have are with people who disagree with me regularly and openly, and whose disagreement I value because I know it's honest. That's worth so much more than agreement that isn't genuine.
Real-life practice. Maya, I'll give you a scenario and you demonstrate the disagreement done well.
Ready?
Scenario 1. Your colleague presents a project plan in a meeting. You think the budget is seriously underestimated. How do you disagree?
I can see the thinking behind this plan. The creative direction is really strong. I'd push back on the budget assumption, though. Based on similar projects I've worked on, I think we're underestimating the production costs by around 30%. Can we look at those numbers before we finalise?
Acknowledge the strength, specific challenge, evidence-based. Question that invites collaboration rather than confrontation. Perfect. Scenario 2. A close friend makes a life decision you genuinely think is a mistake. How do you disagree?
I love you and I want to be honest with you because I think you'd want to know what I'm thinking. I'm worried about this decision, not because I don't trust your judgment, but because of what you've told me about how things have gone before in similar situations. Can I share my concern? And then I'll completely support whatever you decide.
Love expressed first. Honest concern framed as care, not judgment. Specific, not general. Ending with respect for their autonomy. That is disagreement that strengthens a friendship rather than threatening it. Scenario 3. Your manager disagrees with your recommendation in front of the whole team.
I appreciate you raising that. I'd love to understand your thinking further. I wonder if we're looking at different data. Could we take 5 minutes after the meeting to go through the numbers together? I may be missing something important, or there might be a middle ground worth exploring.
Doesn't back down, doesn't fight publicly, requests private conversation, frames it as possible mutual misunderstanding, keeps the door completely open. That is handling a professional disagreement with real maturity and skill. Listener challenge. And this week's requires real courage.
Tell us.
This week, have one disagreement you've been avoiding. One conversation you've been putting off because you didn't know how to have it without damaging the relationship. Use the skills from today. Acknowledge before challenging. Attack the idea, not the person. Lead with curiosity. Use the language of respectful disagreement. And if it can't be resolved, close it gracefully with agreement to disagree.
It doesn't have to be a big disagreement. It could be something small you've been holding back because you weren't sure how to say it. Practice the skills on something low stakes first. Build the muscle. Notice what happens when you disagree well, when the other person stays open rather than becoming defensive.
And come back and tell us how it went. Not the private details, just whether the skills worked, whether the relationship survived the disagreement, whether you felt more or less confident about having difficult conversations afterwards. We read every single comment, and your real experiences guide what we make next. Listener comments and the Going Blank Challenge from episode 12 produced some of the most honest and moving responses we've ever received.
Read them all.
First comment, from a listener in Nigeria. I used tell me about them for the first time this week. My colleague lost her father. I always avoid people who are grieving because I never know what to say and I'm afraid of making it worse. This time I walked up to her and said, "I'm so sorry. Tell me about him." She talked for 20 minutes. She cried. She laughed, remembering him. She hugged me at the end and said thank you for asking about him, not just about me. I cried in the bathroom afterwards. I will never avoid a grieving person again.
Thank you for asking about him, not just about me. That distinction is everything in grief. The grieving person doesn't just need sympathy for their loss. They need their person to be remembered and celebrated. That listener changed how they show up for people in pain forever. That is extraordinary.
Second comment, from a listener in Thailand. I used help me understand with my teenage son for the first time. We have been having the same argument about his studies for 6 months. Every time I told him what he needed to do, every time he shut down. This week I said, help me understand what's making this so hard for you. He talked for 40 minutes. I learned things about his situation at school that I had completely misunderstood. The argument we've been having for 6 months was based on me not understanding the real problem. 2 weeks later, he is studying, because I finally understood what he actually needed.
6 months of the same argument resolved in 40 minutes by asking help me understand instead of telling. The parent had the wrong mental model of the problem the whole time. Curiosity revealed what certainty had hidden for 6 months. That story is going to stay with me for a very long time.
And one more, from a listener in Poland. I wonder if we're defining this differently in a work meeting where 2 senior colleagues had been disagreeing for weeks about a project direction. Neither of them had thought to ask this question. When I said it, the room went quiet. Both colleagues looked at each other. One said, "Actually, what do you mean when you say quality in this context?" 15 minutes later, they had completely resolved a disagreement that had been blocking the project for 3 weeks. I was the most junior person in the room, but I asked the right question.
The most junior person in the room asked one question that unlocked 3 weeks of deadlock. That is the power of the right phrase at the right moment. That listener changed the trajectory of an entire project with 7 words. We are so proud of every single one of you.
And that is episode 13 of Brio English Podcast.
5 skills of disagreeing without destroying the relationship. Acknowledge before you challenge. Attack the idea, never the person. Lead with curiosity, not certainty. Use the exact language of respectful disagreement. I see this quite differently. I'd push back on that. I'm not sure I agree. Can I share why? I wonder if we're defining this differently. And know when to agree to disagree.
Your challenge. Have one disagreement you've been avoiding. Use the skills. Come back and tell us what happened.
Next episode, we're exploring something that I think will genuinely change how you see the people around you. Why some people are almost impossible to argue with. Not because they're aggressive, but because of how they think and communicate. The specific habits that make certain people completely unshakable in any disagreement, and what you can learn from them.
That episode is a direct follow-on from today, and it goes even deeper. Until next week, disagree with courage, disagree with respect, and remember, the strongest relationships are not the ones where people never disagree. They're the ones where people know how to. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.